Dominic Rivera, alias Kane. He was untouchable. A man whose name carried weight in every darkened alley and whispered conversation. A man whose presence alone commanded silence, whose decisions determined the fate of those who crossed his path. Law enforcement feared him, unable, or unwilling, to challenge his reign. Criminals respected him, knowing that to stand against him was a choice few lived to regret. His empire stretched beyond city streets, into boardrooms, into the hands of those sworn to uphold justice. Every door he walked through, heads lowered. Every command he gave was met without hesitation. There was no room for weakness, no space for mistakes. For years, he remained in control, a master of the world he had built. The people around him knew their place. His word was final. His life, meticulously ordered. Every threat was eliminated before it became a problem. Every risk was assessed, calculated, and swiftly handled. He thrived in a world dictated by loyalty and fear, by silence and discretion. He trusted no one fully, and no one dared to betray him. Then came the moment he had never accounted for. A moment of vulnerability that should never have existed. A secret buried so deeply, it was never meant to surface. A secret that threatened everything. One phone call. A voice on the other end of the line. A confession that shattered the foundation he had spent years reinforcing. A name he never expected to hear in the same breath as betrayal. A single decision was all it took to change everything. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one making it. He built an empire on fear, but what happens when the man who fears nothing has everything to lose? February 14, 2023. A day marked by love for most. For him, it was the day everything changed. The day his control slipped. The day his empire faced its greatest threat, not from law enforcement, not from rival cartels, but from the one person he never expected to betray him. It happened in a city that never slept. A city where power dictated survival, where names carried weight, and where fear determined who thrived and who vanished. Here, among towering buildings and neon lights, he had built an empire that stretched from the darkest corners of the underworld to the highest offices of influence. His reach was absolute. His name, unspoken in public, carried the kind of fear that made even the most ruthless criminals hesitate. His men operated with unwavering loyalty, knowing the price of failure. Politicians shook his hand behind closed doors. Judges turned a blind eye in exchange for favors that ensured their futures. Even the police, the very force meant to uphold justice, moved when he allowed them to move. He had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of control. Every deal, every order, every decision was calculated. Nothing was left to chance. Rivals disappeared before they became threats. Informants were silenced before they could speak. And yet, for all his planning, for all his careful maneuvering, there was one thing he had never accounted for. Love. It was a weakness he could never afford. And yet, for years, he allowed it to exist. A carefully hidden secret in a world where secrets meant death. His lover was younger. Handsome. Charismatic. The kind of man who could walk into a room and draw attention without trying. He was everything the drug lord could never be, carefree, unburdened by the weight of power, unafraid of the risks that came with loving someone like him. For years, they had been careful. Meetings arranged in the dead of night. Conversations held in whispers. Promises made in the dark, where no one could see, where no one could hear. And for a long time, it was enough. But something had changed. The lover had changed. He wanted more. More than stolen moments. More than whispered assurances. More than the shadows. At first, the demands were subtle. A lingering look. A question asked with hesitation. When will this end? When will we stop hiding? Then, the questions became ultimatums. And finally, the mistake that sealed his fate. A phone call. A voice on the other end of the line. Not to him. To her. To the woman who bore his last name. The woman who stood beside him in public, who played the role of the devoted wife. The woman who, in the world's eyes, was the only one who could ever claim him. That call should never have happened. That voice should never have spoken. The words that followed should never have been said. But they were. And in that moment, everything he had built, everything he had controlled, began to slip through his fingers. The moment the call was made, the outcome was sealed. She answered, unaware. A familiar voice, but with words she never expected to hear. Words that stripped away the illusion of the life she thought she knew. Words that turned devotion into humiliation, loyalty into fury. My name is Elijah, the voice on the other end said. And I need to tell you the truth about your husband. For years, Elijah had lived in the shadows of another man's life. A man the world feared, a man whose name carried a weight that silenced those who dared to challenge him. That man was Dominic Rivera. A name that law enforcement whispered behind closed doors. A name that ruled the streets with an iron grip. A name that no one, not even the closest in his circle, would ever think to betray. Elijah believed love could change that. That it could force Dominic to make a choice. To stop hiding. To stop pretending. To finally acknowledge the truth they had buried for years. But Elijah never understood what it meant to defy someone like Dominic. This was never a choice. This was a problem. And problems were meant to be solved. Dominic didn't react immediately. He never did. His power didn't come from impulsive rage. It came from precision. Every response was calculated, every action methodical. Emotions had no place in his world. And yet, this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. For the first time in his life, Dominic had been caught off guard. Not by the police, not by a rival, but by someone he had trusted. Someone he had allowed too close. And now, Elijah had made the ultimate mistake. Because Dominic didn't just see the betrayal, he saw the consequences. What would his men think if they found out? What would his enemies say when they realized the most feared crime lord in the city had been living a lie? The world he ruled thrived on perception. Strength. Control. Fear. Elijah had stripped that away with a single phone call. And in doing so, he signed his own death sentence. By the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. For years, Elijah had accepted his place in Dominic Rivera's life. The stolen moments. The secrecy. The lies that kept them hidden. But something had changed. Maybe it was the years of waiting. Maybe it was the way Dominic would walk into a room, hand in hand with Natalia, playing the part of a devoted husband. Maybe it was the realization that no matter how many nights they shared, Elijah would always be the secret. And secrets, they don't last forever. It started small. A lingering silence after Dominic left in the morning. A look in Elijah's eyes that spoke of something deeper. Then came the words. When does this end? How long do I have to wait? And finally, the demand. Leave her. Or I will tell her myself. But Dominic had spent his entire life controlling people. No one told him what to do. Not law enforcement. Not rival cartels. And certainly not Elijah. So he did what he always did. He ignored the problem, hoping it would go away. He thought Elijah would get tired. That he would back down. That he would remember who he was dealing with. But Dominic underestimated just how much Elijah had already decided. Because love makes people believe they're invincible. And Elijah was about to make a choice that would cost him everything. Natalia Rivera wasn't just a wife. She was the wife. The woman Dominic had chosen to stand by his side. The one he brought to charity events. The one who wore the diamond ring that told the world she belonged to him. And that's exactly why Elijah called her. Because if Dominic wouldn't listen to him, maybe he'd listen to her. "My name is Elijah," he told her. "And I need to tell you the truth about your husband." At first, she didn't believe it. This was a joke. A mistake. But Elijah had proof. Dates. Locations. Names of people who had seen them together. And then, the final blow. "I have a recording. You need to hear it." A man's voice. Dominic's voice. Low. Intimate. Saying words no man like him should ever say to another. "I love you, Elijah. You know that, don't you?" Natalia listened to every second of it. And then, without a word, she hung up. The damage was done. The secret was out. And Dominic Rivera was about to find out. In his world, betrayal was never forgiven. And this? This wasn't just betrayal. This was humiliation. A man who controlled entire cities, who had spent decades building a reputation of strength, had just been exposed. Not by a rival. Not by the police. By a lover. A man he had once held in his arms. A man who should have known better. One call. That's all it took. One order. And Elijah was as good as dead. Elijah had no idea that the life he had built in the shadows was about to unravel. That night, he made his way to a luxury hotel in downtown Los Angeles. The marble floors and plush velvet chairs greeted him, but it was the polished surfaces of the lobby's surveillance cameras that would betray him. He had told Dominic he wanted to meet. To fix things. He thought they could talk. Perhaps Dominic had finally realized that their love couldn't be buried in secret any longer. Maybe this was the moment they would escape, together. But the world Elijah had imagined no longer existed. It had never really existed. Dominic was already inside. His men had ensured the room was prepared. Nothing was left to chance. The plan had already been set into motion. Elijah arrived at the hotel room expecting answers. But instead, he was met with a cold, deliberate silence. The room, dimly lit, held only shadows, thick, suffocating, and heavy. Dominic stood by the window, his back to the door. As Elijah entered, his eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of the love he thought he had once been given. But there was none. Dominic turned. His expression unreadable, his face as cold as the silence between them. "You shouldn't have done this," Dominic's voice was calm, too calm. His words measured, deliberate. But his eyes, those eyes, spoke volumes of the anger that simmered beneath the surface. Elijah stood frozen, the weight of the truth settling over him like a heavy cloak. "I just wanted you to be honest with me," he said, voice shaky. "I wanted more." But before Elijah could say anything else, Dominic snapped. The calm facade shattered in an instant. The air between them turned toxic, crackling with years of pent-up rage and betrayal. "I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me?" Dominic shouted. His hand shot out, grabbing Elijah by the collar. And in that moment, the years of lies, secrets, and betrayal culminated in a single, deadly action. Dominic pulled out a gun, a weapon Elijah had never seen before, and in a split second, a single shot rang out. A deafening crack that echoed through the silence. Elijah's body hit the floor with a sickening thud. His eyes wide in shock, his chest still rising in ragged breaths. Dominic stood over him, the gun still smoking in his hand, his expression as empty as the room around him. It was almost as if the murder had been nothing more than a part of the plan. There was no hesitation. No remorse. Just cold efficiency. Dominic's men, who had been waiting outside, rushed in as soon as the gunshot rang out. They didn't need instructions. They knew exactly what to do. Elijah's body was quickly moved. No blood. No trace. No sign that he had ever been there. They wrapped him in a black tarp, lifting his lifeless form as though it were nothing more than a discarded object. Within an hour, everything was cleaned up. The room was spotless. Not a single fingerprint was left behind. And Elijah's body? Gone. The only evidence that remained was the echo of a single shot and the silence that followed. But as meticulous as Dominic's men were, they couldn't cover everything. The cameras never lie. The luxury hotel's security footage, where Elijah had entered but never left, would soon reveal more than Dominic could ever imagine. One of the hotel workers had seen Elijah enter the room, but no one saw him leave. Dominic's men, thinking they had done their job well, failed to notice the most crucial detail. A faint reflection of a black SUV parked nearby, and two men dragging something heavy from the back of the car. As the body sank into the murky waters, Dominic's empire seemed untouched. The silence he had so carefully crafted continued, and the world moved on. But beneath the surface, the walls were starting to close in. The night Elijah Carter vanished, Dominic Rivera thought he had orchestrated the perfect crime. The body was disposed of, the security footage erased, and his men sworn to silence. For a while, it seemed like the case would fade into the shadows, just like so many others linked to his name. But Dominic had underestimated something far more powerful than fear. He had underestimated evidence. At first, Elijah's disappearance wasn't treated as urgent. Local police, wary of Dominic's reach, showed little interest. No witnesses came forward. No body was found. No crime scene was left behind. It was almost as if Elijah had never existed. But the FBI had been watching Dominic for years, building a case against him for drug trafficking, money laundering, organized crime, hidden bank accounts, and shell companies that had been used to launder money for years. But even more damning were the people who had once stood by Dominic's side. When Elijah's name surfaced in connection with Dominic, federal agents took a closer look. And that's when everything began to unravel. Elijah Carter has been the very person the FBI has marked as an eagle when it comes to the case of Dominic. It started with something simple, Elijah's last known location. The night he disappeared, he had been seen entering a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. Security footage showed him walking into the lobby, checking in, waiting in the elevator. He was alone. But there was no footage of him ever leaving. Hotel records showed he had booked the room under his real name, Elijah Carter. But hours later, the hotel system logged a second key card entry, belonging to a guest whose name was nowhere in the records. The alias on that card? A name tied to one of Dominic Rivera's closest men. The FBI now had their first real lead. Then came the missing security footage, or rather, the gaps in it. Hotel surveillance had been erased at key moments, the hallway cameras outside Elijah's room, the lobby footage from that night, even the underground parking garage. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. But erasing digital records leaves behind something just as damning, a digital footprint. FBI forensics recovered fragments of deleted files, enough to see men entering and leaving Elijah's hotel room at odd hours. One of them was unmistakably Dominic Rivera. But that alone wasn't enough. The FBI needed a confession, a witness, or physical evidence. And that's when Dominic's own men began to turn on him. Dominic had always ruled through fear. He believed that loyalty was absolute. That his men would rather die than betray him. But when federal agents started making arrests, offering deals in exchange for information, the first cracks in Dominic's empire appeared. One of his trusted enforcers, a man named Miguel Torres, was the first to break. Facing 25 years for drug trafficking, Miguel realized that Dominic wasn't going to protect him. He had seen what happened to men who knew too much. So, he made a deal. And what he revealed would seal Dominic's fate. Miguel described, in chilling detail, how the order had come down. Elijah needed to disappear, Dominic had said. Make it quick. Make it clean. The plan was simple: lure Elijah to the hotel, convince him they were meeting to talk things over, then end it before he could expose their relationship. Miguel admitted to being part of the cleanup crew. They removed the body, wiped down the room, destroyed evidence. But there was one fatal mistake. The DNA evidence that sealed the case. Miguel's testimony was enough to arrest Dominic, but the FBI still needed something irrefutable, something that would prove he was in the room when Elijah was murdered. That's when forensic teams went back to the hotel. Despite the professional cleanup, one thing had been overlooked: a single droplet of blood. It had been wiped from the carpet, barely visible to the naked eye. But under luminol testing, it lit up like a beacon. DNA results confirmed it: Elijah Carter's blood. Right there, inside the very hotel room Dominic had been seen entering. And there was more. In the parking garage, the FBI found another overlooked piece of evidence: a partial fingerprint on the inside of the trunk of a black SUV. It belonged to Dominic Rivera. But what truly broke the case open, what left no doubt in anyone's mind, was the recording. Unbeknownst to Dominic, Elijah had recorded their final phone conversation. The call, placed just hours before his murder, captured everything. Elijah's desperate voice, pleading for Dominic to acknowledge what they had. Dominic's cold, measured response. And then, the threat. If you tell anyone, Elijah, you know what happens next. That recording, recovered from Elijah's encrypted cloud storage, played in court. It was the moment that sealed Dominic's fate. The once untouchable kingpin was now a man exposed, his empire built on fear, now reduced to silence. On February 14, 2023, Dominic Rivera thought he was untouchable. By the end of the year, he was a convicted murderer. The FBI had taken down many crime bosses before, but none had fallen quite like Dominic. His story wasn't just about crime, it was about power, deception, and the price of believing you are above the law. He had built a world where everyone feared him. But in the end, it wasn't a rival gang, a failed deal, or even law enforcement that destroyed him. It was a secret. A secret he thought he could bury. And the man who refused to be erased. After weeks of surveillance, wiretaps, and careful planning, the FBI knew they had one chance to take down Dominic Rivera without sparking a war in the streets. Rivera was too careful, he never carried a phone, never stayed in one place too long, and his security detail was trained to kill without hesitation. A standard raid wouldn't work. This had to be precise, surgical, and public, to send a message that even the most feared crime lord could fall. The FBI needed to catch him off guard, somewhere he wouldn't expect an ambush. Through wiretapped conversations and insider intel, they learned that Rivera had a weekly dinner meeting at an exclusive restaurant in the city, a place where politicians, celebrities, and powerful criminals all dined in safety. It was neutral ground, no violence, no weapons. Knowing Rivera never allowed his men inside with him, the FBI saw their perfect opportunity. February 28, 2023, 8:43 p.m. The restaurant was filled with the city's elite, waiters moving seamlessly between tables, the scent of expensive wine and steak filling the air. Rivera sat in a private section, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his Rolex glinting under the dim lighting. Unbeknownst to him, his empire was already collapsing. Outside, over 40 FBI agents and U.S. Marshals waited in position. Some posed as restaurant staff, some as customers, blending in perfectly. Across the street, snipers perched on rooftops, ready to neutralize any threats from Rivera's security team outside. At exactly 8:47 p.m., the command was given. A team of FBI agents, dressed as restaurant staff, calmly approached his table. Before Rivera could react, 5 armed agents drew their weapons, aiming directly at him. "Dominic Rivera, you're under arrest." For the first time in years, Rivera was out of control. He didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened slightly. Around the restaurant, diners gasped, pulling out their phones, capturing the moment the most feared man in the city was finally being taken down. No escape. Rivera didn't resist. He knew better. His enforcer, Miguel Torres, sitting at another table, instinctively reached for his concealed weapon, but before he could even touch it, 3 agents tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back. As Rivera stood up, his expensive chair scraping against the marble floor, he adjusted his cuffs, as if he was still in control. But when the cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists, the illusion shattered. Outside, his security detail tried to intervene, but the streets were already blocked off. Armored vehicles, SWAT teams, and helicopters hovering overhead made it clear, there was no escape. As Rivera was led out of the restaurant, flashing red and blue lights illuminated his face. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras captured every second. The city watched as the untouchable kingpin was finally brought down. As he was placed into the back of a black SUV, he smirked, just slightly. As if he knew, this wasn't over. March 1, 2023, 10:12 a.m. FBI Field Office, Interrogation Room 3. The room was stark, gray walls, a metal table, and a single overhead light casting sharp shadows. No windows, no distractions. Just Dominic Rivera and 2 FBI agents. Rivera sat in the chair with an air of detached confidence, his handcuffs resting loosely on the table. Even in a government facility, he still carried an aura of power, like a king sitting through a meaningless meeting. His tailored suit had been replaced with a standard detainee jumpsuit, but he didn't look bothered. Across from him sat Special Agent Jordan Hayes, a man who had spent years chasing him. Beside him, Agent Rebecca Cole, the lead investigator on the Elijah Carter murder case. A silent, heavy tension filled the air. Rivera didn't speak first. He just watched, his expression unreadable, his fingers tapping against the table in an almost lazy rhythm. Agent Hayes leaned forward. "You know why you're here." Rivera let out a slow breath, then smirked slightly. "You really think you can make something stick?" His voice was smooth, unshaken. Agent Cole slid a thick case file onto the table. Inside. Crime scene photos, surveillance stills, forensic reports. One photo, taken from the hotel security cameras, showed Elijah Carter entering the suite. But there was no footage of him leaving. Rivera's eyes flickered to the images, then back up. He didn't react. Agent Cole didn't break eye contact. "He called your wife. Told her everything." Hours later, he vanished. "That's not a coincidence." Rivera let out a low chuckle. "People disappear all the time. Maybe he left town. Maybe he got into trouble. But me? Killing him?" He shook his head slowly. "That's beneath me." Agent Hayes slammed a USB drive onto the table. "You know what's on here? A call from your own men. Talking about cleaning up the mess. About how you handled it. We have their voices. Their location data. Their bank transfers. You think your people won't flip when they realize you're locked up?" For the first time, Rivera's smirk faded. It was small, nearly imperceptible, but it was there. A brief shift, a tiny crack in the armor. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. A long silence stretched between them. Then, he spoke, his voice lower this time. "You don't have a body." Agent Cole didn't blink. "We will." Rivera's fingers stopped tapping. He wasn't smiling anymore. For the first time since his arrest, Dominic Rivera was no longer in control. The trial that followed would come to be known as the trial of the century. The courtroom was packed with reporters, high-powered attorneys, and curious onlookers. But the most compelling presence was that of Dominic Rivera. Still, in control, still calculating. Even in the midst of his trial, Dominic's calm demeanor remained unshaken. He sat in the defendant's chair with the same arrogant confidence that had made him feared across the city. His custom-made suit, his perfectly styled hair, nothing about him seemed out of place. But it was the witnesses that would prove to be his undoing. The first were the people who had once served him. Former allies, now enemies, who were willing to testify against him in exchange for leniency. Each testimony was a blow to Dominic's carefully constructed image. One by one, they described the terror that had defined his rule, the brutal executions, the intimidation tactics, the endless threats to those who crossed him. And then, one of his former close associates, a man who had been with him for years, gave the most damning testimony of all. "I knew Dominic was ruthless," the man said. "But I never thought he'd do something like this. He had a lover, Elijah. And when Elijah threatened to go public, Dominic made sure he never saw the light of day again. He told us to clean up his mess. No one was supposed to find out." The courtroom gasped. The truth, once buried under layers of manipulation and violence, was now out in the open. And it was impossible to deny. But the most chilling moments came when the prosecution revealed the final piece of evidence. The leaked phone recordings of Dominic and Elijah's conversations. The one in which Dominic confessed his feelings for Elijah, only for them to be shattered by the brutal reality of what would follow. It wasn't just a crime of passion, it was the cold, calculated murder of a man who had dared to challenge the very empire Dominic had built. As the closing statements echoed through the courtroom, it was clear that Dominic's empire of fear was crumbling. And then, the final moment came, the verdict. The jury deliberated for days. But there was no doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies were undeniable. The recordings were irrefutable. Dominic Rivera was found guilty of first-degree murder, along with multiple charges of racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. The moment the verdict was read, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Dominic's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. His entire world, the one he had spent decades building, had just shattered in an instant. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No appeals. No way out. The man who had once ruled the streets, who had controlled entire cities with nothing but his name and the fear it inspired, was now nothing more than another convict behind bars. Dominic Rivera had spent his life building an empire where fear was the currency. He had used violence and manipulation to rise to the top, to control everyone and everything around him. But in the end, it was his own pride, his own arrogance, that led to his downfall. He never imagined that the same lover he had discarded so easily would bring him down. Elijah, the one person Dominic thought he could control, had exposed him for what he was. A man who wasn't untouchable. A man who could bleed. And now, Dominic faced the ultimate irony, the one place where his power meant nothing. Prison. Where respect is earned, not demanded. Where money can't buy silence. Where the rules he once controlled no longer apply. And as he sat in his cell, the realization began to sink in. He had spent a lifetime building his empire. But in the end, he had lost the one thing he could never replace, his freedom. But even with a guilty verdict, one question remains. Did he truly act alone? Or were there others, his trusted men, his closest confidants, who helped orchestrate the murder of Elijah Carter and simply never faced justice? Think about it. Elijah wasn't just murdered. He was erased. No body was ever recovered. The hotel footage was wiped clean. Dominic's men were seen disposing of something in the river, but no one ever testified to what exactly was inside that bag. And despite multiple arrests, some of his most dangerous associates were never convicted. So, we ask you. Was Dominic Rivera the only one responsible for Elijah's death? Or were there others, still free, still walking the streets, carrying the weight of a secret they will never confess? What do you think? Was this a crime of passion, or was it a carefully orchestrated execution with more people involved than we'll ever know? Drop your theories in the comments below. And if you think this case was shocking, wait until you hear about another crime that left investigators speechless. And if you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the darkest crimes of our time.